arrangement anyway. But I'm sure all of you know that that my title for this is not. It doesn't mean that there's not ever going to be any more of what we call art. So you can relax if those who are considering this as a career.
I just want to say 2 words. Really quickly, first of all, as Provost of Cowell, I want to welcome you all here. This is a wonderful crowd. Part of the reason we don't have a microphone ready is we really didn't expect this many people, but we certainly should have. My husband, who has a background in art history, called me late in the afternoon to tell me that a legal crisis meant that he had to rush to San Francisco to do something for the Pressmen's Union. And I said, well, I'm sorry you have to go driving all the way up to San Francisco this afternoon and back. And he said, I don't care about the drive. I'm sorry because I'm going to miss Mary's lecture. So for all of us who are fortunate not to have something else that we have to do, I'm very proud and privileged and pleased to introduce Mary, who needs no introduction, to talk in the first of 2 lectures, as she mentioned, on the end of art.
What I'm objecting to and what I feel has to be wiped out as much as possible is the use of the word art and the use of the word artist, which I do this in part because there's never been a great civilization that had such a word. The great production of art was never called art. It never had that kind of identification, and the result of calling it that, which really kind of started in the 18th and 19th century, has been very destructive to art, because as soon as something is defined, actually as soon as a word is used, it usually means that they've lost all contact with what the thing is. See, the word religion was never used until, as it is used now, until the middle, really about the middle of the 19th century, when religion began to fall apart. And then people began to talk about religion and religions. Any time before that, if you said religion, it meant nothing unless the person knew what religion it was. So that in a completely Christian community, if you said this person is religious, you knew what it meant. And in a Buddhist community, if the person said, yes, that's a religious person, you knew what it meant. And there was no connection. I mean, neither would have recognized the other necessarily as religious. So that the word really was not used. But now, of course, it's the most commonest word that you can imagine. We talk about people, having a religion of shopping and all kinds of possibilities of other conceptions of religion. And the result of that is, actually, the result of the use of the word art immediately requires you to say what art is. That is, it requires you to identify it and to describe it. And that's exactly what happened in the 19th, 18th, and 19th century. People began to try to isolate or to say what art is. And the thing which they came up with has lingered in everybody's mind ever since. But before that, art had no name. Art was what you did. I mean, it was you did what was necessary, and it was not you, but it was what was necessary. And that kind of attitude, people, of course, endlessly made works of art, because we are that kind of a creature which cannot not make works of art. We cannot stop it. We will make something, and so it's an absolute part of our nature. We want to make something that's right and good, and we have it in our mind, it's not right yet. It's not right yet. Yes, it is. Now it's it. But that sense of wanting to make something and to make it right is an absolute human activity, total, forever human activity. And the subtext of that, which is that some people also want to make images, and there's no stopping it. There's absolutely no stopping it. They will do it. And I remember once seeing one of the most moving objects I ever saw, which was something that actually a senile person had made under the sheets in the hospital, in bed, and in the dark and never seeing it, but had made this little object. And it had the most, scary kind of power. I mean, it just was it seemed to just sum up all of the mystery of making something and the desire to do it. So it is what we do. And of course, you have to become aware of its power and its power for destruction, that we do want to do this. Art is, as you know, honored by being in the Ten Commandments. You cannot make yourself any graven image or the likeness of anything in the heavens above, the earth beneath, or the waters under the earth. Why not? Because it has such enormous power. It has the power that almost nothing else has that is a thing that's like art. I mean, there's no commandment against mathematics as far as I know. And there's no commandment against reading or even there's no commandment about food, a diet, which is always extremely important in any religious thing. And there's no commandment about clothes. You see, none of those things, but about art only. And it is because all of these things are power. And this elevates, you see, art to the same power as murder, as theft, as lying, as adultery. These are things which the commandments say we must not do. But then also whoever wrote the commandments, God or Moses, has a perfect conviction that we're going to keep right on doing it. and it couldn't be more correct. You see, that is what happens. And if there wasn't the expectation of people keeping on doing it, you could just say you have one commandment. Don't be bad, Something simple like that. Anyway, why is it? You see, it's graven images. The making of images, that thing which we will do, and which we will because we cannot help it. You see, we invest it with enormous power and meaning, and that there's no question, and there's really no question. You see, of whether it's art or not. What it is a graven image, and there's no little footnotes on that, saying whether it is art or not art, and what all of the things which we say, because it's, in our present time, one of the extraordinary questions, which is a 20th century question, and actually I think, though I don't know how you could explore it entirely, but I think has never been asked before at any time in any civilization. Even in our sort of dark twin, the Roman world, people didn't ask this question. They never asked it. They knew what art was. They knew that art was something which was made in Greece and which they wanted. And the people who had a lot of money had Cicero. If I'd only known that about Cicero, I would have had more interest in him in my youth. But I had to take interest, so I still had some. But he had agents in Greece all of the time. And he wasn't saying, buy me some art. He was saying, buy me an Apollo, or buy me a Prometheus, buy whoever it is, Venus, whatever, because he wanted these things. He knew that they were what he wanted. And he had the money to get them. And people who didn't have that much money simply did exactly the same thing which we do. They bought a reproduction. They had another, there was a great big industry of the making of works of art from Greece. Mm-hmm. And different cities had different subject matter. So that one might have the subject matter of heroes, and the other might have Venuses, and so on. So that it was because people wanted it, and they couldn't make it. They tried, but they couldn't. So no hope of that. So they had to buy it, but they didn't call it art, and they didn't think of it as art. They thought of it as something which I want, that I can put in the garden or put in the house or wherever it is. but it was not under the idea of art. And of course, in the great period of of the making of Greek art, the word was techne only. The making of something is techne, having to do with actual making, actual, almost like our word manufacturing. So that attitude is the most general one. And then suddenly, really, in the 18th, 19th, and now in our time, there was a feeling that art is something which can be defined, something that can be measured, something that can be actually can be made because you know how it's made, and therefore you can make it. And that conclusion is still in most people's mind, because the conclusion was that art is beautiful. That was the first part of it. Art is beautiful. Beauty is its own excuse for being. Therefore, art is its own excuse for being. And this idea that it has no obligation to anything, it is its own self, and it is absolutely without any kind of relationship really to anything else. Now, that idea is a poisonous one, and it is one which separates art, the making of things, from the rest of people and all of the whole world, so that you can have people actually saying, and I know that there isn't a person in this house who hasn't heard people ask this question. And it usually begins, yes, but. And it's yes, but. And whatever you've said before, it's pretty, it's decorative, it has to do with whatever kind of mutterings that you make about what it is. And they say, yes, but. Is it art? And that is, you see it in the papers, you see it in everything, and great anguishes develop over it, Is it art if you put a crucifix in urine? Oh, no, some people say, because art is beautiful and uplifting. The other people say, it might be, is it art? It's a whole, and then you see the idea that if it's art, if somebody says it's art, if somebody says, yes, it's art, then they're quite satisfied, and then anything is acceptable. It doesn't matter, you see, because it's art, and art is its own excuse for being, and therefore it is, you're perfectly content. Most people are perfectly content with that idea. Now, I know that you know this, and I know that you know how this happens, and I want to show you two pictures, Bruce, if we can have a slide. Everybody can hear. Anybody who can't hear, raise a hand, and I'll shout louder. Let's look at this one, and then look at the next one. Bingo, bingo. We'll look back at this one after this. In front of which of these two pictures is somebody going to say is, yes, but is it art? And every single one of you know. There isn't a person who said, well, I don't know, maybe there's no equivocation and no necessity for any, because we all know right away which one it is, and why is that. And see, why is that? Look, let's look back at the other one and see why people would not say that. They might say any number of other things, but they would not say, yes, but is it art? Heavens above, girl. Woo! Yes. Now, why would you see what this means is that actually that idea, that definition of art as something which is beautiful, something which has a kind of purity to it, and is also appealing or pretty, or really, something which is ingratiating, and something which has a kind of implication beyond itself, and there's some kind of elevation of the spirit when you look at it. And it's true that this does have that. This is a pretty beautiful thing, It's just, it is you really don't need to see this on, but you can't help it. Two other, it's a painting. So this one on the left is one, and that one on the right is the one I'm talking about, really, because it's the one that most people would would feel, and they would recognize it anywhere. If they came into your house and you had that on the wall, they'd say she has art on the wall. They wouldn't have any. They wouldn't have to hesitate a minute. They'd know that it was art, and they'd know that it was on the wall, and they would know that showed a kind of cultural sensitivity that would make you want to have art on the wall, which is a very distinguished thing to do. And there is a quality of some kind of elevation of the spirit, and in that painting, it's an extremely cool and strongly sensitive to the flowers and to the bays and to the view beyond it, so that the whole thing becomes like a little fragment of poetry or something. But it is something in which we know that they're roses, and that this all it's meant by roses. We know that it is a sea. We know that all of these things, and seeing them in this kind of clarified or purified or form makes us have these experiences. These actual, what they are, of course, is an empathic response, and that is what really what all the enjoyment of art can come from. It does come from, and it may not be because it's perfectly possible to have a feeling of not wanting that kind of thing, and then you say, yes, it's art, but I don't like it. I don't want anything to do with it. I don't like it, and that's perfect. That's always true. That's the great joy of art. Let's look at the next one for a moment, because this one, it would immediately, for many people, though this kind of thing has been going on now for, well, it's safe to say 50 years, 60 years, and yet, and it's been going on under the title of art, and it's been made and bought and entered the whole world as a work of art, and as something which is recognizably as a work of art. Now, the only way that you would absolutely have to recognize it as a work of art is if you were in a building which had art on the top of it. So that when you went in, you would have the faith and the confidence, and that they wouldn't dare put it there if they weren't going to put art in it. So you have a start then right away with whether or not it's art, and then of course you could say, what can you say? You could say, my 2-year-old child could do this, or I could do this with blindfolds on. It's perfectly true, absolutely true. You could perfectly easily do this with blindfolds on, but you don't have the right name to sign on it. So it wouldn't make any difference. It wouldn't make any difference to anybody. And if you consider art to be something which is really indefinable, so that you do ask the question, and then it can be easy to answer it in the affirmative. So you can say, well, yes, that's right. That's a work of art, and that's exactly what does happen. So that kind of thing may seem too bad, but that's what nonetheless does happen. Now, what actually? Let's look at the next slide that we had here. Why is it, and what is it that actually makes us want to make an image? Though we know we shouldn't, or whether we don't know we shouldn't, it still doesn't make any difference. We're going to do it. Now, why is that? It is something which is absolutely inherent in our natures, and it's something which I can demonstrate to you, which is that when you want an image of something, and there aren't any images of it. In other words, what condition you're in is that that there is a new desire or a new need or a new idea that has not been ever represented, because it is a new one, and therefore it doesn't. Now, one of the easiest places to see this is at the beginning of Christianity, when the early Christians wanted terribly, I mean, they wanted absolutely to make it clear what they believed or what was going on or what events and so on that they felt people had to see. Why did they have to see it? Because we want to see it, because we don't have the imagination to make it up, no matter what it is. Imagine if you didn't know what the face of Christ has become to look like, and you were asked to make one. Well, you see, you'd have a terrible time, first of all, avoiding the one that you knew. That would be your first difficulty, trying not to be like that. And yet you really wouldn't be able to, because it is a powerful image which has been going on for a long time, and it's settled into people. So the effort to make a new image would be extremely difficult, and you would have to have a perfectly enormous visual imagination to be able to make one. And that was what was required, you see, at the beginning of Christianity. And what actually happens is that people can't do that right away. Unless there's some person who's born with this great gift, they can't do it. And so what do? They want to make, for instance, they just do what they can. And they do, and this is usually not any good, and they know it. And they make a picture of baptism. Usually they have to write under it, this is a picture of baptism. Because they know perfectly well that you wouldn't have a clue, was this person being patted on the head for getting a spelling contest, you have no idea, absolutely no idea. But it was the best they could do, you see. They were not trained. It was mostly people who were not. And that were not trained at all would be doing this, and this is always true at the beginning of something, because in a sense there isn't any training for this. There isn't any training for how to do this. And so what they do is, it's just like stick figures. Let's look at the next one. I have a wonderful. And one of the things which they do is literally grab around for what's there and try to see if you can't use that, you know, and that's exactly what they do. And so, for the figure of Christ, they use one of the most ancient figures in the world, which is the ram bearer, as it's called. It's in Egypt and it's in Rome. It's everywhere. But it was, of course, it was not Christian. It was just that it was also Christian. Could be, in a sense, made Christian because Christ is a good shepherd. Was one of the early images of him, and then it becomes overlaid with the idea of Orpheus and with the idea of King David, because David, of course, sang so beautifully that the animals all came and gathered around him, and the wild animals came and gathered too, and which is exactly the same thing that Orpheus did. That is, Orpheus sang and the animals came, and so that Christ as a good shepherd becomes completed with these other people, and therefore gets a kind of strength that isn't really, it's from mind, not from what you see, but actually what you know. And let's look at the next one. And this is the raising of Lazarus from the dead. Well, again, I have to tell you, see, and because they really cannot do what they want to do. But they do the best they can. And the best that they can is to try to use what other people have done, or other people at the same time have done. Anyway, they reach for something which is already there, and hope to fix it or make it more what they really want. Let's look at the next one. All of these are in the catacombs, so they're very early, about the 3rd century AD. Oh my, they're the children in the fiery furnace after Shadrach and Abednego, and they're all standing on their heads, but standing on their outstretched arms. But there again, you see, I mean, you couldn't possibly get to that, that these are 3 people in the furnace burning, you know. They're like a little chorus line. See, it actually, but if you know it, and if you don't know if it's written under it, then you know it. You don't make the confusion that you would otherwise. And oh my goodness, we got a mic and anyway, I don't know whether it makes any difference or not. However, the things which, the images which the early Christians made were images that were supposed to instruct you. I mean, this is supposed to instruct you in the power of God, so that the people who were thrown into the fiery furnace for heresy were protected by God and did not burn, you see. Whereas the people who put them in did burn up. I mean, they got too close and burned up, but not Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego. And there they are. But you see, so marvelously inscrutable if you didn't know it. And let me just give you one piece of serious instruction, which is don't believe that a picture is worth 10,000 words. A picture is worth mighty little, unless, if it intends to convey something, it's worth mighty little unless you know what it is it's going to, or trying to convey. And also, don't for a moment believe that sculpture was the book of the illiterate in the great cathedrals and so on, because again, it's exactly the same thing. Anybody who didn't know what they were about could never on God's earth tell you what they were about. And for many sculptures of the Middle Ages and later and earlier ones, people don't know who they are, and they've spent years, being scholars and trying to figure out, is this Abraham or under Melchizedek? I mean, it is impossible to tell. And then many of the things, of course, are from stories which have now long disappeared. So that it isn't a matter. You have to know, in fact, to have the full experience of any work of art, actually, and particularly one which has an intention of saying something or getting across some kind of an idea. Let's look at the next one. Now, there's the Last Supper. Now, think in your mind, what Leonardo did with this same idea. And you have the whole thing that I'm trying to tell you, see, and that actually what is being made because it's needed. They wanted people to keep remembering the Last Supper because it's an important sacrament of the church. So the only way they did it was by making people sit on around the table, and not even hardly a very good table. And very hard to identify who's who in this. And then when you think of what Leonardo did with exactly the same subject matter, I mean, he was doing it for exactly the same reason. That is, he wanted people to know, to experience, to feel what it was to have the Last Supper and to be sitting with Christ in that, and all of his disciples. And the drama of it, knowing that one of the disciples would betray him, all of that he wanted, and these people wanted too. They wanted that too. But they couldn't do it. They literally couldn't do it. My gosh, we got another one. I don't know whether we actually need any, but we've got now quantities of them. So anyway, what's the difference? See, one of the great differences is that Leonardo had the craft, the ability to actually make what he wanted to be there. And that's the whole nature of craft. Whether what you want to make turns out to be what you do make. Not something which is half like it or not a bit like it or anything, but actually is what you intended to make and wanted to make, and there it is. And craft, which has now, a terrible name. People think that it's unimportant, they think it's vulgar. They even think, you see, that if something shows any craft, it can't be art. And I know people who actually feel that, or they think if it shows any kind of skill at all, then it obviously it's described as slick or described as a number. But this is a deep misunderstanding of craft, because the nature of craft is that it should be invisible. You should not know how it happens. It should be magical. And any craft that isn't is simply it's just inadequate, because your craft is not adequate to making this thing magical. It really is a rabbit out of a hat. You've got to have the rabbit hat conception in order to realize that the hat is it's an inert, common, uninteresting object, but out of it you can bring a living thing. And so any craft that doesn't achieve this is a waste of time, really. It's a waste of time. So it has to have this magic. And when it's just exactly as when you go to a magician's thing, you're surprised if you can understand or if you can see the trick. And of course, it's highly likely that you cannot see the trick. You will think that you do, or you will try to make an explanation of it. But if you once learned that magical tricks are extremely expensive, and there's a place in Ohio where you buy them. And when I found this out, I was absolutely delighted. But you pay an enormous sum. I mean, it's just, and there are people there, see, that are working out these tricks and these astonishments and these magical moments for us all. And then whoever's going to use them has got to buy it, and he's got to pay a lot. It's not something cheap. It's not anything cheap. But it has to have the power to make us feel that we maybe do understand it, but know that we really don't. I mean, so that we keep that mystification all the time. That's why it's no good to take a little child. Have any of you ever tried this? Take a child to any magical performance, because everything is magical to them. And so he cuts a woman in two. Well, yeah, that's nice. Absolutely no point in doing it. You've got to have a pretty firm idea of what is possible before you can enjoy what's impossible. So it's exactly what they don't have. So what Leonardo had was an extraordinary gift. He was able to do the thing that he intended. Let's look at the next slide. Now, one of the great, and to me, endlessly delightful mysteries of the world is that the image of Apollo, which you see here, this is Apollo Belvedere. At one time, this was considered one of the greatest works of art in the world. Now people dismiss it as a kind of a mannerist, Hellenistic image. I mean, it has lost all of that quality because of our turning against, first of all, the extraordinary craft, which it shows. I mean, this is something perfectly evident. And it was, of course, a continuing and very important, very desirable actual image of Apollo. Apollo was the god of healing as well as the god of the arts. And so it's a combination of arts and healing. It's a marvelous, anybody who's looking for a god, this is quite a nice possibility for them. With our double interest in healing and in the arts, you see, it's really quite fine. So there he is, and his head slightly busted, but broken off by the screen, not by reality. Let's look at the next. Let's look at the next. Now, the Christians wanted an image of Christ, and so they looked around, and the only one that they thought was suitable was the image of Apollo. But they didn't know how to do it by any manner of means. But it was nonetheless what they wanted to do. And so what they were able, and they were, after all, carving something, a freestanding thing takes a lot of skill. It's not something which anybody can do immediately. And so that they use this image of Christ as a good shepherd. And then can you raise him up a little so to see his feet, and then we can look back down. Let's see. Oh, that's enough. Now then, put him back down. And and actually make, they did. They tried to make him as handsome as they could. And one of the aspects of handsomeness, over and over in the history of art, is curly hair. And curly hair forgives a great deal. And it's really right from the Venus of Willendorf right down to the modern times. It's, as somebody said, television is about nothing but hair. And it's not if you ever dare to watch, it's absolutely true. Hair after hair appears on it, mostly curly. Anyway, there he is, curls and all. And he tries to have that Grecian straight nose, far nose thing. But it doesn't work on his face because his face is too short. And even the lamb looks rather like an anteater rather than now, the sad thing is this man didn't intend this lamb to look like an anteater at all. He intended it to look like a lamb. And though he must have, and anybody in that time would have seen hundreds of lambs, all the time, still, to make it in marble, that's much, much harder. It is harder. Now let's look at the next one, because this is supposed to be, you see, a figure. And here are these other. All they want to do is to tell you something. And they want to tell you about the loaves and the fishes. So the wonderful miracle of the feeding of thousands with the loaves and the fishes. And that's what they're trying to tell you. You can see the loaves in these arcs and the little containers down below for the rest of them. And then, because they wanted to tell you as much as they could, and you knew this, you see, you could recognize it, you would never otherwise know what is going on there. It's like that Christ is hitting somebody on the head. Actually, he's raising Lazarus from the dead. And it's a very marvelous kind of thing. So let's look at the next one. And you see what a handsome, this is of course the entry into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, where the people up in the trees throwing their palms down and clothes down, and he's riding in on that donkey. And there's a kind of wonderful youthfulness, a completely youthful look on and the whole thing that the early Christian art teaches is that Christ at the beginning was a miracle healer, and young, extremely young, and absolutely innocent, and that this quality, and also that he had a magical ability. He had ability to make miracles, to make the blind see and crippled walk and all those things. So that his whole appeal was in this handsome young healer, and he's shown that way exclusively. There's no other way up through the 4th century. And let's look at the next one. Next one, that's Jonah. After this is a whale over here. It looks like a dragon. The whale has spat out Jonah, and he's lying under the tree, and resting. I'm sure all of you remember the story. But it is one of the stories that's used over and over again. Why? Because Jonah was in the belly of the whale for 3 days. And this becomes a parallel for Christ being in the grave for 3 days and then rising from the grave. So that exactly as Jonah is let to be out on the land again. And that therefore this image, which I think you would have a great deal of difficulty either even recognizing it, because you can't help thinking that there's hardly room for Jonah in that beast at all. I mean, much less how is he going to get through that neck and get out, It doesn't do from the point of view of any kind of reason or anything of, any of the ordinary world. It becomes completely mysterious. And let's look at the next one, because that's the same subject. There again, you see, you have Jonah being thrown into the sea and therefore swallowed by, again, that dragony whale. Remember that? he was thrown out of the boat because they said thought he brought bad luck, and so they threw him out into the ocean, and then he was swallowed by a whale. I mean, by some beast, and there he is being looking quite like a little child about to be spanked. You see, he's got hanging over fingers. And then there's the beast ready to swallow him right there. So, and he does. Let's look at the next one. Now, what I find one of the wonderful and almost inexplicable things is that this same Greek background, which was not achieved, you see, they never were able to reach it, never were able to make it. They stopped being interested in making it, but they never learned how. Nor did anybody else. The Romans had spent 400 years trying to make something that was just like the Greek work, but they could never do it because it was impossible. And the Christians never got any farther than the things we saw. And so when you see this head, one of the mysteries of the world is that the image of Buddha is from the image of Apollo. And it gets to India by Alexander the Great. And everywhere that Alexander the Great went, he put up sculptures of Apollo and also himself. And he was an extraordinarily handsome and wonderful person, and one that you should always pay very close attention to, because he was a student of Aristotle, and he knew about measure in all things, and he died of being drunk and alcohol and generally misbehaving in all kinds of ways. And so it's humiliating to all teachers to realize that the greatest teacher with his greatest student wasn't able even to make a dent in what he was thinking. So Alexander's worth thinking about on that. So let's look at the next one. What happens is that in India, and Buddha was born in the 6th century BC, a great extraordinary century in which every kind of thing was born. The Buddha was not represented in Indian art, and he was not represented, or at least there's nothing was left of it. There's no, and people wondered, you see, because India is the most dedicated and most voracious maker of sculpture that has ever existed, except possibly Egypt. But the taste for it and the skill at it and the desire for it, all of these things are so great, and yet there's no example from about the 6th century, no piece of sculpture about Buddhism or Buddhism until about the 2nd century BC. So it is a mystery, but you can see, when you see, this, is there another one before that, Bruce, or is it? Oh, it's so beautiful, I can't stand that. One of the things that is so fascinating and amazing about it is that yes, that's the one. That's called the Gandharan style, because Gandhara was where you first have these things. And as you look at this, you can see that first of all, there's that wet drapery that we all know from Greece, you know, and the broad shoulders, the whole body having a real physical body in it, and then one of the things which is so fascinating is that these early Buddhas all have a top knot, and it's called the bump of enlightenment. And what actually it is derived from the Apollo figure, even from the actual one that we first saw, the Apollo Belvedere, who has his hair pulled up into a little bunch of curls at the top, and then the rest of it streaming down, and that then becomes this bump of enlightenment, and it stays in the Buddhist image, you see, for hundreds and hundreds of years, and it is exactly as that sweep from the forehead to the nose. All of these things come from the seeing the Greek work, and that is really the great extraordinary characteristic of any high style, any strong style in the arts. And everybody It knows right away that it's marvelous and they wish they could do it, and they try to do it. And that's exactly what happened. And then after that, let's look at the next one. What they do is what all people do, you see, when they're faced with something which they have to imagine a new thing. They pick up what is around, and then they gradually bring it into the actual image that they want, if they have the skill, so that they move it, you see, from that very heavy and very Western face, actually, and everything about it, into this, entirely different. It's just a very, very delicate and exquisite, and absolutely as though it had never been anywhere near Greece, except for his top knot and hair. Let's look at the next one. And that becomes more and more distant from the Greek original. It comes farther and farther away. It gets to be more fuller face and fuller mouth. And one of the great things that it does is turn the gaze down, so that the gaze becomes interior. And in the Apollo figure, the gaze is out, looking at the whole world and seeing great distances, but never catching their eye. And that's exactly what happens with the important thing that happens is that the gaze turns inward. And so that it then begins to lose all kind of sense of the Greek. It becomes what it wants to become, which is a work of art come into existence besides our own urge to do it, that we recognize there's a need, and other people also recognize that they have a need for this. It's not something which they do frivolously. It's not something which they do with any kind of sense that they're just expressing themselves. It's that they know that there is a need for this, and the need for the image of Buddha changes. See, it becomes more and more close to the Indian images and close to something which is very un-Greek. Let's look at the next slide. No wonder it's curly here. And now, again, you see, we look at the Good Shepherd. This is another one. It's not the one that you saw before. Let's look at the next one. I just wanted you to recall it. That image of Christ became intolerable. Miracle working boy. And why? Because that is the image which they needed by that time, because Christianity was then established, and it was a law that was established. And so he becomes a judge, and he becomes, of course, finally the judge. So he loses all of that early quality and becomes entirely the judge of the last judgment. And let's look at the next slide. There is, and this has got a name, which is Pantocrator. I mean, not only this, but this kind of image, which it means a stern judge and lawgiver. So he moves, you see, from being a miracle-working child to a stern judge and lawgiver. Why? Because people want that image. They don't want the other one anymore. And the other one seems to them irrelevant and pointless. Now it is Christ as judge that continues right on through. Let's look at the next one. And it's really alarming and intended to be. And in this slide, it may not be quite as alarming as it is in reality, because in reality, it's way over life size. And it's way up in a church, which is mostly dark. And you can see only this glowering and scary stern judge and lawgiver. And that is the way it's treated. And then you see the other wonderful thing, you trace some qualities of the Greek, but what has happened to his eyes? His eyes now become burning and large and scary, and he's looking in a very judgmental way at the rest of the world, exactly the opposite of what happens with the eyes of the Buddha. You see, where the whole thing turns in, this whole thing turns right at you, and at you, not like the Apollo Belvedere looking off into space, you see, but pinning you with his gaze. And that is the image that remains of Christ up to about the 19th century. Let's look at the next one. I think one way that you can see this is enjoyable is to see the changes in the Virgin Mary, because she appears very early as a mother and child, and of course she continues to develop all through the time. But you can see what the needs of people are. And this one is back at the beginning thing where, I can set this down. This is the best I can do. Let's look at the next one. There she is. It's like somebody famous. I can't think of it. Anyway, so there she is, again, taking on some of the characteristics of the Pantocrator. With those great eyes. That's a strange little baby. Let's look at the next one. I mean, they're all, but always it is a sense of the sacredness and extraordinariness. It is an icon of sacred image. Next. Okay, you see, there's no movement toward you. The whole thing is self-contained, and it is like a block. The mother and the child are identical. Now, think how wonderful that is for people in the Middle Ages, and this is a very early 14th, 13th century thing. How marvelous to know that Mary and the Christ child are absolutely one piece, because everybody knew that Mary was endlessly merciful, and everybody knew that Christ was the judge in the last judgment. And to have somebody on your side that had a complete control of who's going to be the judge is very comforting, very comforting. And so the adoration of Mary, simply, though the church did everything to kind of keep it from it, they were never able to. Because why? Because Mary was endlessly merciful and would always forgive and always want people to have the best possible, and was very devoted to people who were in love with each other. And she famously was a little nun in one of the convents, fell in love with a man and ran away from the convent, and then he died 40 years later. And she thought, I'll go back and maybe they'll let me wash the dishes or something. And she went back and nobody knew that she'd gone, because the Virgin had taken her place, you see, all of this time. So she was that kind of person. And therefore very treasured, very highly treasured. Most of the cathedrals are devoted to her. Let's look at the next one, because you can see how here she is as the Queen of Heaven. Wonderful 13th century. Very, but look at the size of Jesus compared to the size of her. And you figure which one has more power? Doesn't take much to figure it out just when you look at this, you see. And then what's a little baby on somebody's arm? Who's in charge there? The mother. Let's look at the next one. There's wonderful. That's the head of that one. Wonderful, smiling and charming. Let's look at the next one. And then it moves from being just a very, very charming and delightful woman with a baby that also looks like a baby and is having a nice time with his mother's lap. Let's look at the next one. And there she is. This has been broken and the baby is long gone. But this time she's very charming a person, and also very fashionable. You see, because she's in the late 14th century, and it began to be in the 14th, 15th century, the most seductive thing about a woman was her forehead. And if she had a very high and domey forehead, she was just, was like having magnificent legs, beautiful bosoms. It was all of these things in one. And women, in fact, did, that they'll do anything in the world to accommodate the dreams of other people, and themselves. They had to pluck their hair back until they would pluck it halfway back to their head, you see, and really in the middle. And if any of you ever plucked your eyebrows, God forbid, you'll have some idea of what it would be like to pluck half of your hair out. And yet, that was necessary to look at, and there she is, you see, as stylish as you could ask. Nobody has a higher bar than that. And also she has a cute sort of flirtatious look. So, but people wanted, they no longer wanted that, the powerful Queen of Heaven. They wanted a kind of friendly, some person who would be a friend to them. Let's look at the next. And would forgive them everything. When there is something which is new, something which has not been seen before, not really been seen before, sometimes there is an imagination. Now, this is quite rare, but sometimes there is an imagination which is powerful enough to make something new. And that is not something which is usual at all. It is very unusual. And instead of having to take this from that and that from the other and make something new out of this kind of actually quilting together, some artists, some people appear who have this enormous imagination. And at the end of the 14th century, which was, of course, a disaster century at the time of the Black Death and so on, a third of the people died, the unimaginable horrors of it. And at the end of that, a young man appears who is able to give a vision that will last for 500 years. And almost nobody, who cares about art or knows about art, even knows his name. I mean, obviously not people who studied it, but he is an extraordinary appearance because the painting has continued to be really two-dimensional, always on against the golden ground. So that because it was thought that it was believed theologically that everything appears in the mind of God. Anything which is actually in living or in the world is in the mind of God. And the mind of God, therefore, was seen as gold, because gold, of course, is such an extraordinary metal and always has been. And it represents purity, it represents its inability to be destroyed in any way by any other thing. So gold remains the main powerful thing. And the Virgin, you see, is shown enthroned, and the child small still, so that this continues that same vision, and she's surrounded by angels and saints down below. And along comes Masaccio, and let's look at the next slide. Everything is gone from that world, and the world that we know is there. First of all, there's space, and you see the whole great excitement of the Renaissance was in the actual physical space, and it became that all the way through. But it had this amazing artist who could make the appearance of space on a flat surface. That is very difficult. It's extremely difficult. And nobody on earth knows how he was able to do it. Nobody on earth knows how he could do anything like that. And also, he died when he was 26 years old. So he had at the outside, you see, 6 years to do it, 7 years. And what he did, which was in Florence, what he did was create the world that we know, and create the vision of the world that we know, so that it has depth, and you feel as though you're standing beneath those figures that are beside the throne. You see the marvelous architecture, the classical architecture, which he had seen in Rome and ruined, and the cobble ceiling, and the sense of shadow, the sense of things moving out of shadow and light, which are absolutely essential if you're going to be concerned with the actual world, the physical world. And the power to do it can disappear in a moment, and it can also really not seem important. So that between the paintings of the Roman Empire, that would be about the 4th century A.D., would be the last one, really the third. And Masaccio, who was at the beginning of the 15th century, no one had a shadow. No shadow was ever painted. People stood and they had no shadow. They walked, they had in gardens and so far, whatever they were, against the wall, because couldn't be, because everything was really existing in the mind of God. And so there's just none at all. And here comes Masaccio, able to make the feeling of depth and of shadow and light and of the whole world that we know and live in. And the people that are in it are not just stuffed figures, and they're not just icons. They're not something that's just perfectly meant to stand for something because it can't be something. And there he and no one can explain it. But it does happen. And it is the other thing that changes, and the need for change is always the need of some new world vision, some new comprehension. That means that that this no longer, the old thing will no longer do. And so the thing that you saw before, from this time on, will no longer do. Nobody will consider it worth doing, because they won't believe it. That's what the next thing. And from that you see exactly into what happens with Leonardo, who's just simply carrying on exactly the same, the conviction that what we see is in part light, created by light and shadow. What we must know is the actual body of people actually know how these arms are articulated, how these legs work. And because what we are seeing is a new world, and it's the world of the material actuality. And whether it's using a sacred image or whether it's not, it is in a way always real, as we would call it, real, having to do, dealing with what we see, dealing with what we know, and using it to, of course, to explain or to help us understand something that we don't see. But this is this could only have happened, and everybody knew it. See, you've got to realize that everybody knew that what Masaccio was doing was not only unlike what anybody else was doing, but also it was what everybody wanted to do. And in fact, everybody that wanted to be a painter went and copied his work. And among them, Michelangelo. Michelangelo copied his work and got in a fight with somebody and got his nose broken. That's why he looks that way, because he was fighting about Masaccio in a place where it was dangerous to do that. So he was actually had his nose broken doing this. But every artist had to do it. Every artist knew that he had to do it. Why? Because they knew this was a new way of looking, and they wanted to know how you did it. They wanted to know, how is this done? And then, of course, they wanted to do it. So that it's a totally extraordinary thing that happens. Let's look at the next slide. And then it continues. So it continues right on, so that, again, there's nobody saying, is this art? Nobody's saying. They know it's art. And they know that it's art because it shows the world as we know it, and we can experience it when we look at it. And that goes right on for the next 500 years. And here I'm showing you an example of 19th century painting, and it's a cautionary tale, because this is a painting by a woman named Rosa Bonheur, and she painted animals, and she was an extraordinary woman, undoubtedly, but she was paid for her work more highly than anybody else living at the time, and this is in the middle of the 19th century. She got $10,000 for painting. $10,000 at that time meant a lifetime of money. You could just hardly spend it. And she was allowed by the state, by France, to wear men's clothes. Because what did she do? When she painted animals. She went to the slaughterhouses. And in the slaughterhouses, she actually, you see, anatomized the animals. And she herself kept a kind of zoo. She's an amazing, marvelous woman, absolutely fascinating to think of her existing. But she was considered a treasure of France and was given every kind of honor and every amount of money that anybody would want. And what was she doing? She was saying, art is the depiction of the world with an aspect of beauty, with an aspect of some kind of vivid living into the thing. And so she brings these marvelous horses to the horse fair, letting a range. You see, this is a range. It's not what you just automatically see. you are given that the white horses are in some ways extraordinary and beautiful, which they are, but they're made to be absolutely that way. Let's look at the next slide. And the same thing with the sheep. You see this again. If you asked anybody right now, nobody's going to stand in front of that and say, "Is it art?" Unless it's some smart aleck painter. Otherwise, and he would be saying it for the effect, because he knows perfectly well that it's art. And any way you describe it. So let's look at the next one. And at the same time, you see, that she was doing that, Monet was doing this garden and doing all of these things. That is right in the middle of the 19th century. And both of them lasted throughout the 19th century. But you see, what has happened? Here is a totally different conception of what it is that you make when you make an image. And this one is totally, entirely dependent on the idea of light and light affecting whatever. And it was the Impressionists, all of the Impressionists, believed that you could really find out how things exist in the visual world by understanding optics. And this, of course, it was a great scientific century. And they joined them in wanting to understand and believing that they could, and believing furthermore that this was the obligation of the artist. Let's look at the next slide. There's another one of his, because it's beautiful, of course, too. Despite the fact that he would resent that. I mean, because it wasn't intended to be beautiful, it was intended to be accurate, it was intended to be right, accurate, nothing of that. Let's look at the next one. And there's another one. All of them are what people still would recognize and think of as art. Let's look at the next one. Then you get another imagination, you see, which is just as extraordinary as the imagination of Masaccio. And that is, and what happens, I believe, what happens really from the end of the 19th century right to our own time is an effort of the artist to understand what it is that art is. Because they're as mystified as anybody else. And the whole development of art is in a way of kind of, is this art? Is that art? Is this art? And different people like Mondrian said that art had to be absolutely pure. And it should never show anything, there were no graven images, and that it should have, as its whole point, was a spiritual quality of absolute purity and non-figurative things. And he was convinced of this. He was an anthroposophist and was a student of Annie Besant and the whole mystical aspect of the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th. And so he makes this. And then what happens, you see? What happens is that this is an image that is very enormously powerful. And that once he releases it from his mind, it simply spreads over the whole world, and everybody has a Mondrian somewhere in their house. So it's not called that, and it's not signed, but it may be the linoleum, or it may be the design on the, whatever it is, but endless, almost nothing would look the same if it hadn't been for Mondrian. He made that kind of stamp. And then the puzzle, the difficulty, the puzzle of the 20th century is that there's so many people who have this powerful new image or new understanding, of which Mondrian, of course, is one of the most conspicuous. And there's a house in Santa Monica that is built from one of these paintings. That you can see where the door is, and the lattice over there, rest of the entrance and the little red window to peek through. So it immediately turns into anything: architecture, book design, rugs, whatever, because it is an image that is captivating and seems to us some way true, and it's not what he intended, but it's nonetheless. Let's look at the next one. And then when you see something from Jackson Pollock, again, I mean, this is an imagination that said, art is not pure, art is the opposite of pure. Art is absolutely a chaos, and a chaos full of filth and dirt. And you know he always put cigarettes in when he was smoking, he just drop them in the paint and so on. And this has caused a great deal of bewilderment and difficulty for people who are trying to restore his work, because within 10 years of when any of them were painted, they had to be restored. It was that kind of marvelous, total indifference to craft of any kind. In the sense that craft, if you were concerned about craft, that meant you could not be concerned about art. And that was very strong, and it still is very strong. I can't tell you how many people think so. And that's what he thought, and fortunately, people care to restore it. Let's look at the next one. But to get those cigarettes, some of which have gone out of business. And another thing which the artist Lichtenstein really understood and made us understand, which is that the nature of art is an emotional and a thing having to do with our interrelations with people, and that anything which is done as a comic book is more powerful than almost anything that an artist of the present time can do, because it taps into something which people know, and of course it's perfectly true, it's perfectly evident. There are many more people who know even, say, Little Abner than know, I suppose, Klein or some modern painter. Let's go to the next. So he made people realize that this is art, and that it made people realize that this is a way of what art can be. Let's look at the next page. And then sometimes this is carried rather far. And you know, you begin to wonder, and you might yourself, no matter how sophisticated, stand in front of it and say, is it art? You know? Yes, but is it art? And this is just a dump load of dirt on the floor. And it's part of what happens because of the sense of art being sufficient to itself. That it doesn't have any obligation, and it has actually an obligation not to have an obligation. That it aims to make it something which you do not like and do not understand and do not have anything to do with. And then, you see, then if you can say, yes, it's art, it's a really extraordinary triumph. Let's look at the next one. This didn't take as much time, but and won't be anywhere near as hard to clean up. Let's look at the next one. But all of these are ways of testing the question. And the artist himself doing it, and the people who come in having to do it. So that it's this extraordinary thing that we don't know how to say what it is. We don't really know what it is. And when we see it, we don't know what it is. We don't know whether it's art or not art. So, and here's again art of emptiness. Not hard to do. I mean, you're not for 3-year-old, but for 10-year-old. And then sometimes it's just how messy everything can be, how full of stuff, how absolutely bewilderingly chaotic. And it's another way of saying what this is. That stuff kicking in the bottom and the whole thing. Let's look at the next one. And then this money on the mind. Money on the brain. Well, that's what it is. But, you know, you don't ask, is it art? You ask, so what? I mean, it's entirely different for most people, except the very humble person. Let's look at the next one. Now, how this happens is an extraordinary thing, because you can see it in the work of Philip Dustin, who was one of the great abstract expressionists, and when he left abstract expressionists to draw, and left to make graven images. And he made such an image as this, and yet, let's look at the other one, next one. And yet he could draw like this. something anybody immediately seeing it knows this is magnificent. Perfectly beautiful, extraordinary, sensitive thing. And we look back at the Ku Klux Klan. He's going to hit somebody, got his hand up and stuff. It's even hard to see what it is, but it is a cartoon figure. And that's one of the things that the artists is people making images are drawn to. They're drawn to something which is the kind of lowest common denominator, and that they feel is really, entirely untouched by the sophisticated criticisms and theories of art and so on. So let's look at the next one. You see, the same artist doing at the same time these two things. And this exactly makes the question, can art be both? Let's look at the next one. And this is his self-portrait with his wife. And he sees again, it goes straight into cartooning because cartooning has no kind of intellectual or fancified or theoretical background. And what is the artist? The artist is simply a huge eye. And his wife is curly hair. That arch over there. Let's look at the next one. Oh my, long feet. Feet. It's turning around. This terrible creature coming toward the flowering both of them. It is, of course, it's a very moving, very powerful style. Let's straighten her up because this is his actual drawing of his wife. It was made at the same time as the one that you saw. So that again, it's the same business. That is the drawing of Lisa, his wife. See them again, piece of more. I probably put it in wrong. I'm terrible. Again, nobody standing in front of this would say it long. They know that this is an extraordinary, and people, they just know it right away. And then happens to the image that they had in their book against another one, the next one. It's also one that's painted at the same time. Drawn face. His wife drowning. Let's look at the next one. And the cartoon becomes the most, at the end of his life, completely as far away from abstract expressionists as you can get into the actual cartooning world. And the automobiles, from all the early cartoons, and it's armed Ku Klux Klan. It's a terrible weapon, and it aims to be disagreeable, make you uncomfortable, make you afraid. That's what it is. And this, which I consider one of his last readings, is one of his most moving, because it again, through the cartoons, he's constantly trying to see not only what is art, but what is not. And at the end of his life, an artist is a person in time who has a hand and brushes and he's in bed with his wife. Thank you.